17 years of mortgage payments, school lunches made in silence, and all it took was a single turkey sandwich to end a marriage. My name is Cliff Froman from Alpharetta, Georgia. Do not look away from this screen, because what I laid on that kitchen island during my wife's lavish 40th birthday party is going to teach you a permanent lesson. When a woman mistakes a husband's calm sacrifice for weakness, she sets off a countdown that will shatter every single illusion she built her life upon. For 17 years, I was the invisible foundation holding up her luxury lifestyle, while she treated me like a parasite in my own home. She thought I was just a passive man taking her insults. She had no idea that while she was playing the wealthy corporate maven for her social circle, I was secretly preparing a legal trap. A trap that would strip away her pride, reclaim my dignity, and leave her standing alone in a house she never owned. Welcome to Dad's ultimate payback. Get comfortable, hit that like button, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from today. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of what happened next. Back in 2007, long before the cold silences and the passive-aggressive comments, Nancy and I were two completely different people living in two completely different worlds. She was 29 years old and absolutely drowning under a mountain of predatory student loans, over $100,000 in high-interest debt that compounded faster than she could breathe. Debt collectors were calling her before her alarm went off in the morning, and she couldn't even qualify for a modest apartment lease in her own name. She was brilliant, driven, and utterly trapped. I was 32, pulling serious weight as a senior solutions architect at a major cloud infrastructure firm in Midtown Atlanta. The hours were brutal, 70 hours a week easily, but my stock options had been steadily compounding for years. I saw a brilliant woman I loved being crushed by her past, so I made a decision. I liquidated everything with a single wire transfer. At our wedding reception, held at a beautiful venue on Old Milton Parkway, I handed her a small white envelope near the coat closet away from the crowd. Inside was a folded card containing the bank's zero-balance confirmation receipt for her entire student debt. No public speech, no microphone, no grand spectacle. Just 30 seconds between the two of us. When she opened the card and saw the string of zeros, her knees buckled. She looked up at me and sobbed like I have never seen another human being cry before or since. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her hands shaking violently. "I know," I told her softly, holding her close. "We start our life completely clean." That was the exact moment I believed I had built an unbreakable foundation with my new wife. What I didn't realize until much later was that toxicity already ran deep in her family's bloodline. Less than 10 minutes after that tender moment near the coat closet, I walked toward the bar to grab 2 glasses of champagne. As I rounded the corner near the velvet curtains, I caught the unmistakable, sharp voice of Nancy's mother, Sandra, whispering intently to Nancy's younger sister, Ashley. Sandra was adjusting her pearl necklace with a sneer, leaning in close. "Don't let your sister get fooled by that grand gesture," Sandra hissed under her breath. "He only paid off her debt to chain her down and control her. No decent man parades his money around on his wedding day unless he wants leverage. Mark my words, he's tying her hands so she can never leave." Ashley nodded along, looking toward the coat closet with cold disdain. The words hit me like a splash of ice water, but I stood there in my suit, took a deep breath, and chose not to cause a scene. I naively told myself that my actions over time would prove my sincerity and melt away her mother's deep-seated cynicism. I was dead wrong. 8 months after the wedding, Atlanta's tech sector took a sudden hit, and my division was eliminated in a corporate restructuring. It was a standard industry setback, but the timing was complicated because we were already under contract on a 4-bedroom home on Wyndham Crest Drive in an upscale Alpharetta neighborhood. Because I was temporarily between tech jobs and Nancy had no established credit history, the mortgage lender restructured the entire deal. The loan approval, the deed, the closing papers, everything was written solely under my name, backed entirely by my remaining liquid assets, my stellar credit score, and my single signature. The night before closing, Nancy sat across from me at our rented kitchen table. The legal documents spread out before us. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she picked up the pen. "You're saving us again, Cliff," she wept, holding her hand over her heart. "This house is going to be our sacred sanctuary. I swear to you, I will cherish this home and honor what you've done for our family forever." She signed her name as a witness, pressing her forehead against my shoulder. "We're saving us," I reassured her, kissing her forehead. We moved into the Windham Crest house 3 weeks later, and I immediately threw myself into making it a home. A year later, Nancy landed her first real corporate recruiting position at a firm in Sandy Springs, making $52,000 a year. That was when I made a second deliberate, selfless choice for our future. Instead of throwing myself back into the high-stress, 70-hour-a-week corporate cloud architecture grind, I accepted a stable project management position with the municipal government off Haynesbridge Road. It meant lower pay, but it offered predictable hours, a solid government pension, a premium family health insurance package, and most importantly, the ability to be a present father when our children arrived. Nancy was now completely debt-free, career mobile, and unburdened. I figured we were an unstoppable team. However, the moment Nancy received her very first independent paycheck, a subtle dark shift occurred behind closed doors. Without saying a word to me, she drove to a different bank branch in Roswell and opened a completely private personal savings account that I had no access to. 2 weeks later, while I was out in the backyard installing the HOA-approved privacy fence, a delivery truck pulled up. A solid, fireproof digital safe was unloaded and brought up to our master bedroom closet. When I walked upstairs and asked her why she needed a coated steel safe tucked behind her clothes, her posture instantly turned defensive. She set the digital combination without letting me see the numbers, turned around, and crossed her arms. "A modern, career-driven woman needs her own financial privacy, Cliff," she said, her voice carrying a newfound sharpness that mimicked her mother's tone. "It's not personal. It's just smart." I stood at the closet door in my dirt-stained work clothes, staring at the black steel box resting in the corner, realizing that while I had poured every single dollar I owned into our shared foundation, my wife was already building a fortress to protect herself from me. Over the next 7 years, a slow poison seeped into the foundation of our marriage. Nancy climbed the corporate ladder at her tech firm, eventually securing a promotion to senior corporate recruiter with a glowing $105,000 annual salary. In a healthy marriage, that milestone would have been a shared victory. In ours, it marked the birth of an insatiable arrogance. It started with her leased 2023 Mercedes GLE 450, a gleaming white luxury SUV with a panoramic roof that practically announced itself to the entire neighborhood every time it pulled into our driveway. Then came the endless grocery hauls from Whole Foods on North Point Parkway, featuring $70 artisanal olive oils, imported cheeses, and sparkling water in $5 glass bottles. Soon, my Instagram feed was filled with her weekend getaways to Savannah, Charleston, and Scottsdale alongside her corporate girlfriends, complete with captions about how hard she worked to afford her lavish life. She certainly worked hard, but the grotesque truth she conveniently ignored was that she had zero household overhead. My municipal paycheck was stripped bare before I ever saw a dime of it. Every month, $3, $200 went directly toward our mortgage on Windham Crest Drive, alongside thousands more for semi-annual Fulton County property taxes, HOA fees, home insurance, and the premium family health coverage that kept all four of us protected without a single gap. Meanwhile, Nancy's $6,000 monthly take-home pay remained pure, untouched discretionary cash. She was living like a high-rolling millionaire in Alpharetta, simply because I was functioning as her entire financial infrastructure. She enjoyed the luxury of a trust fund lifestyle while I carried the crushing weight of reality on my shoulders. The toxic fruit of this arrangement ripened during a Sunday family dinner at a Nashville hot chicken restaurant on Roswell Road. Nancy's mother, Sandra, a retired schoolteacher from Smyrna with a sharp tongue and an even sharper instinct for cruelty, was visiting for the weekend alongside Nancy's sister, Ashley. David, now 16, and 13-year-old Marcy were sitting at the table, enjoying their food. I was passing a basket of cornbread when Sandra deliberately set her glass down, looked across the booth at my worn flannel shirt, and raised her voice just loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "Cliff, dear, when are you going to upgrade that eyesore in the driveway?" Sandra asked with a patronizing smirk. "Driving around in that old 2019 Honda Pilot is just embarrassing for the kids in a neighborhood like Alpharetta. All their friends' parents drive European cars, you know." I felt my jaw tighten, but before I could respond, Nancy jumped right in to twist the knife deeper. She patted her mother's hand, let out a condescending chuckle, and glanced at our children. "Oh, Mom, don't press him," Nancy sneered smoothly. "Cliff chose his cozy little 9-to-5 government job, so he doesn't have to think too hard. You can't expect a man with zero corporate drive to keep up with someone who actually carries the heavy financial lifting for this family." Sandra laughed aloud into her cloth napkin, while Ashley smirked toward the ceiling. I sat motionless, holding the plate of cornbread, thinking about the $100,000 debt wire transfer, the deed written solely in my name, and the zero-balance receipt tucked inside a wedding card. I passed the bread in silence, swallowing my pride for the sake of peace. Tragically, the poison had already infected my son. A week after that dinner, 16-year-old David sat in the passenger seat of my Honda Pilot as we pulled off Wills Road near his high school campus. As I approached the main entrance, David suddenly grabbed his backpack and pointed nervously toward a side street. "Dad, stop the car right here," he muttered, refusing to make eye contact. "Drop me off half a block down. I'll walk." When I asked him why, he rolled his eyes with a cold, teenage sneer that mimicked his mother's exact tone. "Because everyone sees the Mercedes when Mom drops me off, and I don't want my friends seeing me step out of this outdated junk." My heart shattered right there in the driver's seat. I parked where he asked, watched him walk away without a backward glance, and sat in silence while the engine idling hummed against my chest. The final insult to my dignity arrived on a chilly Saturday afternoon. For years, my one personal sanctuary had been maintaining our lawn and garden. I kept a neat, organized rack of heavy-duty gardening tools in the corner of the garage, tools my late father had passed down to me, meticulously oiled and cared for. When I came home from a site inspection, I found the corner of the garage completely empty. I walked out to the driveway and found my father's tools jammed callously inside the trash bin by the curb. When I confronted Nancy in the kitchen, she didn't even look up from her iPad. She casually wiped down the quartz counter and shrugged. "I threw them out, Cliff," she said with cold indifference. They were rusty, cheap trash that ruined the aesthetic of the garage whenever I parked my Mercedes. Buy some plastic ones if you really need to dig in the dirt, or, better yet, pay a landscaping crew like normal people do. I stood there in the garage doorway, looking at the empty space where my father's memory used to rest, realizing that my wife didn't just take my financial sacrifice for granted. She actively despised everything I was. By late autumn, the emotional climate inside our home on Wyndham Crest Drive had turned colder than the November winds sweeping across Alpharetta. The disrespect that had been festering for years finally escalated into open contempt. It began on a crisp Tuesday evening when 16-year-old David walked into the kitchen, holding a glossy brochure for an elite travel baseball program, a prestigious circuit featuring regional tournaments across Georgia and the Carolinas. He stood near the island, his eyes shining with the frantic ambition of a teenage athlete wanting to make varsity. The entry fee was $4,000, due immediately. I took the paperwork, sat down with a pencil, and looked at our family calendar. My semi-annual Fulton County property tax bill, a brutal $6,000 expense, was hitting my checking account in 11 days. I looked up at my son with a calm, encouraging smile. "David, buddy, this is a great program," I said gently. "I can't write a $4,000 check this exact week because of the tax bill, but sit down with me this weekend. We'll map out the budget for next month, and I'll make sure you get on that field." David immediately slumped his shoulders, letting out a dramatic, bitter sigh, the exact rehearsed sigh of a child who had been taught by his mother to expect nothing but disappointment from his father. Before I could say another word, Nancy strutted into the kitchen, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She didn't ask what we were discussing. She simply read the tension in the room and moved in for the kill. Reaching into her designer leather tote, she pulled out a gleaming American Express Platinum card and slammed it onto the granite counter with a loud, theatrical slap. "Here you go, sweetie," Nancy cooed, wrapping her arm around David's shoulders while staring straight past me as if I were invisible. "Mommy's got you covered. It's a tragic shame that only one parent in this house actually cares about your talent and your future." David's face lit up like Christmas morning. He grabbed the card, gave his mother a fierce hug, and walked out of the room without offering me a single glance. I sat alone at the table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling the icy sting of being turned into a stranger in my own home, the absolute breaking point. The moment that permanently shattered 17 years of uncomplaining endurance arrived the following evening. It was a bleak, overcast Wednesday in mid-November. I had spent 8 grueling hours managing a municipal water main rehabilitation project off Webbridge Road, standing in a muddy trench while freezing rain soaked through my work boots. My lower back was throbbing with a dull ache. My hands were calloused and stiff from the cold, and my coffee had gone stone cold by 9 in the morning. I arrived home past 7, exhausted to the bone, changed out of my damp work clothes, and walked into the serene kitchen to make myself a simple dinner. I pulled out a loaf of Whole Foods sourdough bread, a package of deli turkey, and a specialty glass jar of stone-ground brown mustard, the kind Nancy had insisted on buying because the plastic bottle version was suddenly beneath her standards. I laid out 2 slices of bread on a ceramic plate, completely absorbed in the simple comfort of making a meal. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open. Nancy walked in, still wearing her tailored navy work blazer, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She stopped in the doorway and stared at me with an expression of pure disgust, as if watching a stray animal rifling through her belongings. Without uttering a single word, she crossed the kitchen floor with deliberate, aggressive steps. She reached out, snatched the plate directly out of my hands, and set it on the counter behind her back. In one fluid, dismissive motion, she slammed the refrigerator door shut with her hip, leaned in close, and looked me dead in the eyes. Her voice was flat, ice cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Buy your own food, Cliff," she said, each word dripping with venomous malice. "Stop living off me. I am sick and tired of feeding an anchor." The kitchen fell into a suffocating dead silence. I stood motionless in my own house, the house I had purchased with my premarital assets, the house whose mortgage, property taxes, and insurance I had single-handedly paid for 17 straight years. I looked at my wife, remembering the wire transfer that cleared her $100,000 debt, the tears she wept on our wedding night, and the promise she made to cherish our home forever. Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of her words, Nancy's eyes narrowed with sudden, explosive rage. She reached across the counter, grabbed the glass jar of brown mustard, and violently whipped it onto the hard porcelain floor tiles at my feet. The jar shattered into dozens of sharp fragments, splattering yellow mustard and broken glass across my worn leather slippers and the lower cabinets. "Look at the mess you made," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at the floor. "Clean up your filth before you leave my kitchen." She turned on her heel and walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. I didn't scream. I didn't punch a wall, nor did I chase after her. I slowly dropped to my knees, picked up the jagged shards of glass one by one with my bare hands, and wiped the mustard from the tile until the floor was spotless. When I stood up, something deep inside my chest had permanently clicked into place. The anger was completely gone, replaced by the crystal-clear resolve of a man who was finally done. Angry men make noise. Men who are done make moves. I looked at the empty countertop, wiped my hands on a paper towel, and said in a steady whisper to the room, "Understood." I walked down the hall to my bedroom, closed the door softly, opened my laptop, and began gathering the financial records that would tear her gilded world apart. The counter was officially running at precisely 8:45 the following morning. I pulled my Honda Pilot into the parking lot of a professional complex off North Point Parkway. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, adjusting my tie and taking a slow, deep breath. The raw sting from the night before was gone, replaced by the calculating precision of an engineer about to dismantle a structural failure. In my lap rested a thick leather briefcase containing 17 years of immaculate documentation. Every bank statement, wire receipt, property tax assessment, and insurance policy I had filed away. I stepped out of the vehicle, walked through the glass doors, and took the elevator up to the third floor. Attorney Rebecca Owens was a legend in Fulton County family law. A mid-50s former family court judge with sharp, silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes, she was the kind of legal strategist who had heard every pathetic lie imaginable, yet treated her clients with razor-sharp respect. She met me in her sunlit office, greeted me with a firm handshake, and motioned toward a leather armchair. Without saying a word, I opened my briefcase, laid out the organized folders across her polished oak desk, and told her my story, from the wedding wire transfer to the smashed mustard jar on my kitchen floor. Rebecca put on her reading glasses and spent 20 uninterrupted minutes examining the paper trail. The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of documents and the click of her pen. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable, but a faint, dangerous spark danced in her eyes. "Mr. Froman," she said, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the desk, "do you realize what you've handed me?" "I'm starting to understand," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. She began pulling the folders toward her, breaking down the financial math with cold, surgical efficiency. First came the house on Wyndham Crest Drive. Because the original mortgage, the deed, and the closing assets were established solely in my name during my brief tech gap, and because the equity was built upon my premarital capital, the property was legally classified as separate, non-marital real estate. Given the extreme structural deficit you've been running to keep this household afloat while your wife hoarded her income, Rebecca explained, tapping the paper, we can petition the court for an emergency conditional authorization. We sell the house off-market to an institutional real estate investment group. Clean, 30-day cash close. The net equity won't go to her. It goes straight into a court-monitored escrow account. Then she pulled out the folded wire confirmation receipt from my wedding night, the proof of my $100, Zuzozin premarital stock liquidation that paid off Nancy's student loans. Rebecca smiled, a cold, brilliant smile that chilled me to the bone. "This is where the trap snaps shut, Cliff," she said. "Nancy's legal team will argue that this was a marital gift, but because you paid it off prior to her drawing a single paycheck as your wife, and because she used that zero balance credit score to qualify for her high-earning corporate career and lease her luxury Mercedes, we frame this as a direct financial advance against her marital share. The court escrow equity will be applied as an offset against her student loan debt. In plain English, the money from the house sale repays your premarital estate before she sees a single dime." Next, Rebecca turned her attention to the children. I explained my daily routine, driving David and Marcy down GA 400 every morning for years, making 4 home-cooked meals a week, attending every recital, sitting in cold bleachers at travel baseball games, and taking lower government pay specifically to be present. Rebecca pulled up her computer monitor, typed rapidly, and turned the screen toward me. She had pulled up Nancy's public LinkedIn profile, highlighting a series of boastful posts Nancy had written over the past 2 years. In one post, complete with a selfie in an airport lounge, Nancy had bragged about working 70-hour weeks and traveling across Charlotte, Dallas, and Chicago to close recruiting deals. "Your wife just handed us primary physical custody on a silver platter," Rebecca said, clicking through the time-stamped posts. She documented her own chronic absence under the guise of corporate hustle. "Combined with your 17-year history as the primary caregiver, No judge in Fulton County will remove those children from your daily care and routine. Finally, Rebecca pulled out a legal calculator. She entered Nancy's gross annual salary of $105,000, entered my municipal income, ran the official state of Georgia child support worksheets, and added the temporary spousal support guidelines on top. She turned the calculator face toward me. I looked at the digital display. The calculated number was $2, $500 per month, payable by Nancy Jenkins Froman to Clifford Froman, beginning immediately upon court order. I stared at the number for a long moment. It wasn't about revenge or greed. It was the poetic balance of an equation that had been broken for nearly 2 decades. The woman who had snatched a plate of food out of my hands and called me a useless anchor was about to be legally mandated to pay $2, $500 a month to the very man she claimed to be feeding. "We file the emergency petitions quietly this afternoon," Rebecca said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. "The cash buyer is already lined up, the escrow account is ready, and the court mandate will be signed by Friday. Can you go home every night for the next few weeks and act like nothing has changed?" I looked out the window at the morning traffic on North Point Parkway, feeling a rock-solid peace settle over my shoulders. "I've been acting for 17 years, Rebecca," I said softly. "A few more weeks won't be a problem at all." She nodded, pulled out her pen, and said, "Then let's get to work." Executing a silent, legal ambush is not a test of strategy. It is a brutal test of nerves. The attorneys handled the courtroom filings, the financial disclosures, and the emergency motions, but you are the one who has to drive home every single evening, walk through the front door, and sit across the kitchen table from a person who believes she still owns you. For 5 agonizing weeks, I moved through our home on Wyndham Crest Drive like an actor playing the most disciplined role of his life. I maintained my precise daily routine without a single crack. I woke up at dawn, cooked breakfast, paid the utility bills, and drove David and Marcy down GA 400 every morning while the autumn skies grew colder and darker. I absorbed Nancy's dismissive glares and ignored her condescending sighs, letting her believe that her insult over the turkey sandwich had succeeded in cowing me into permanent submission. During the second week of November, 13-year-old Marcy had a winter choral showcase at her middle school in Johns Creek. I took a half-day off from my municipal job, ironed my shirt, and arrived 40 minutes early to secure a seat in the 3rd row. When Marcy stepped onto the risers with her choir, her eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto me. She instantly flashed me the look, that specific uncomfortable teenage grimace that pleaded, "Dad, please blend into the wall so my friends don't notice you." Without a single word of complaint, I quietly picked up my coat, stood up, and moved back 4 rows to sit near the exit doors, smiling warmly at her from a distance. She sang like an angel. When the applause broke, I clapped louder than anyone in the auditorium. Afterward, as the crowd filed out, she found me near the heavy glass doors while her friends hovered nearby. "You didn't have to come." "Dad," she mumbled, looking down at her shoes. "I know, sweetheart," I replied softly. "You were incredible." She offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to her friends. I drove home in the dark, telling myself that one day she would understand. 2 weeks later, David's travel baseball team reached a championship tournament down at a sports complex in McDonough, a grueling 40-minute drive south of Alpharetta. The Saturday weather was miserable, bringing a biting 40-degree wind and a steady, freezing drizzle that soaked through every layer of clothing. I sat alone on the cold aluminum bleachers with a cheap gas station coffee, wrapping my arms around my chest to keep my shivering left shoulder steady. While Nancy was at an upscale brunch in Buckhead with her corporate friends, I spent 4 hours in that freezing drizzle watching my son play the game of his life. In the bottom of the 6th inning, with 2 runners on base, David made a breathtaking diving catch at third base, sliding across the wet clay to secure the final out. The entire dugout exploded, leaping over the railing to mob him. I stood up on the bleachers, spilling half my scalding coffee onto my denim jacket, yelling his name until my throat was raw. On the drive back north toward Alpharetta, David sat in the passenger seat with his mud-splattered gear bag at his feet, texting furiously on his phone. About 20 minutes into the ride, he pulled one earbud out and glanced at the dashboard display. "Mom says she's going to post the video highlights on her Instagram page," he said, his voice flat and nonchalant. I kept my eyes fixed on the rain-slicked highway, the wipers rhythmic and steady against the windshield. "Your mother wasn't at the game, David," I said gently, keeping my tone completely neutral. "Coach recorded it on his tablet. She always posts when they send her the link." David froze. He looked at me for 3 long seconds, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to argue, but the unyielding truth settled in the cab. He slowly slid the earbud back into his ear, turned his head toward the passenger window, and stared out at the dark Georgia pines sliding past in silence. While I was quietly upholding my duties as a father, the legal gears were spinning toward their absolute climax. By late November, Rebecca Owens had secured the conditional court mandate, and the real estate investment group had finalized the 30-day cash agreement to purchase the Wyndham Crest House off-market. With my portion of the arrangement locked, I signed a lease on a bright, pristine 3-bedroom apartment on Kimball Bridge Road, located within the exact same school district and along the same morning drive route, ensuring zero disruption to David and Marcy's daily lives. On a Tuesday afternoon while Nancy was at her Sandy Springs office, I packed 3 large duffel bags with my personal belongings, the items that were mine before our marriage, my father's old photos, my work documents, and my clothes. I staged the bags in the back of the hallway coat closet, hidden neatly behind the long winter coats. Nancy's 40th birthday was scheduled for Saturday, December 14th. True to her nature, she had organized a lavish, self-aggrandizing celebrations, a catered event for 20 family members and corporate acquaintances. Her mother, Sandra, was flying in from Smyrna, and her sister, Ashley, was driving up from Macon. Nancy had mentioned the party to me twice in passing, both times without looking up from her phone, treating me like a hired staff member who was expected to stay out of the sight of her guests. I simply smiled and told her it sounded like a wonderful afternoon. On the Sunday before the party, while Nancy, C, and Ashley were out shopping at North Point Mall, I sat alone at the kitchen island. On the granite counter rested a large presentation box wrapped in deep burgundy paper and tied with a thick, wide white ribbon. Inside that box sat a 3-inch thick leather binder containing the legal machinery of her ruin: the official divorce petition, the motion for primary physical custody, the emergency court order mandating the off-market cash sale of the house to satisfy her premarital debt, and the binding support worksheet ordering her to pay $2,500 a month. On top of the binder, I tucked a crisp, handwritten birthday card. It read, "Happy 40th birthday, Nancy. It's time to start paying for your own life." I creased the edges of the burgundy paper with precision, tied the white bow twice until it sat perfectly, and set the box on the hallway shelf, right above my packed duffel bags, waiting for Saturday afternoon. Saturday, December 14th, arrived under the gloomy canopy of a cold, overcast Alpharetta sky. On the outside, it appeared like any other gray winter morning. But inside our Wyndham Crest home, Nancy was in full production mode. She had hired a high-end catering crew out of Roswell, who arrived early in sleek black uniforms, setting up chafing dishes and elegant floral arrangements across the kitchen island. A massive custom banner stretching across the dining room wall declared, "Celebrating her 40th," in glittering gold script. By 1:30 p.m., 20 guests filled the house. Nancy's mother, Sandra, swept through the front door in a camel coat, narrating the house to Nancy's aunt like a high-end real estate agent, while boasting about her daughter's corporate triumphs. Center stage on the kitchen counter sat an elaborate bakery cake, adorned with a high-resolution, edible fondant photo of Nancy's own corporate headshot. Nancy glided through the crowd in a deep green designer dress, holding court as the undisputed star of her own universe, while David and Marcy orbited on the periphery, glued to their phones. At precisely 3:15 p.m., the catering staff dimmed the recessed lighting, lit the birthday candles, and the 20 assembled guests gathered around the kitchen island. They sang Happy Birthday with loud cheer. Nancy leaned into the moment with practiced theatrical grace. Eyes closed, chin tilted up, one hand pressed against her heart to soak in every second of admiration. As the applause died down and someone shouted for a speech, I stepped out of the hallway. I was holding the large gift box wrapped in deep burgundy paper, tied with the immaculate white ribbon. A sudden hush fell over the room as 20 pairs of eyes tracked the husband, who had been treated like a ghost all afternoon, now moving directly toward the center of the kitchen. Nancy turned and saw the box in my hands. She glanced at her sister Ashley with a small, involuntary smirk, that subtle, condescending look derived from years of conditioned superiority. "Well, let's see what he managed to scrape together," she sneered lightly, stepping forward to take the box. Holding it up briefly for her audience like a trophy, she set it down on the quartz island, unknotted the white ribbon, and tore through the burgundy paper. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolute silence descended upon the room as Nancy stared into the box. Her brain struggled to process the 3-inch legal binder resting inside instead of jewelry or designer goods. Then, every drop of color drained from her face, turning her skin ash white as her fingers trembled violently. With 2 manicured fingers, she lifted the top document, the formal petition for dissolution of marriage, followed by the motion for primary physical custody. Beneath those lay the court's emergency mandate granting exclusive possession of the property to me for an immediate off-market cash liquidation to satisfy her premarital debt offset, giving her a ticking 7-day clock to vacate the premises. And circled in bright red ink right on the support worksheet was the state-calculated support figure, $2,500 per month, payable by Nancy Jenkins Froman to Clifford Froman, with the first installment due that coming Friday. The party atmosphere shattered instantly. Sandra peered over her daughter's shaking shoulder, read enough of the legal headings to understand what was happening, and let out a blood-curdling screech that echoed off the high ceilings. "Are you insane?" Sandra screamed, her face contorting with grotesque, uncontrolled rage. "On her 40th birthday? In front of her family and guests? You vindictive, pathetic, dirty little coward. You have always been a useless parasite, and this just proves what a despicable worm you really are." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned my head, locked eyes with Sandra, and delivered a response that cut through her hysteria like a razor blade. "Sandra," I said, my voice ice-cold, steady, and loud enough for every single guest to hear, "you spent the last 7 years boasting to anyone who would listen about how your daughter carries the heavy financial lifting in this family. Well, congratulations, now she actually gets to do it. Her very first check to me is $2,500, and it's due this Friday." The words landed with the crushing force of a sledgehammer. Sandra gasped for air, her eyes bulging as the color flushed out of her face. She clutched her chest in sheer shock, her blood pressure spiking so violently that her knees buckled on the hardwood floor. Ashley and Tom had to rush forward and catch her by the arms, hastily guiding her into a dining chair as she slumped over, hyperventilating and completely stripped of her venomous voice. Nancy remained frozen at the kitchen island, clutching the legal binder against her dress, staring at me in horrified, exposed silence as the illusion of her perfect life crumbled into ash before her entire world. The room hung in a suffocating, frozen silence. Sandra was gasping for air on a dining chair. Ashley was frantically rubbing her mother's back, and the 20 guests stood paralyzed like statues beside the chafing dishes and the custom birthday banner. Nancy remained pinned against the quartz counter, clutching the 3-inch legal binder to her chest, her eyes wide, glassy, and completely hollow. I looked past the catered spread and the fondant cake to where my 2 children were standing near the hallway archway. 16-year-old David was frozen, his phone dangling loosely in his hand, his jaw clenched tight as his sharp mind processed the scene. 13-year-old Marcy stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes darting between her trembling mother and the cold composure in my eyes. I took 3 slow steps toward my children, stopping right in the center of the kitchen, where everyone in the house could hear every single syllable I uttered. I didn't yell. I didn't drop my voice to a whisper. I spoke with the clear weight of a father who was finally laying down a burden he had carried in secret for 17 long years. "David Marcy," I said, my voice cutting through the thick air with absolute authority. "For years, you too have been subtly taught to look at me like a failure. A quiet, boring man who couldn't buy your affection with flashy European cars, luxury trips, or designer clothes. But here is the truth your mother never told you. Before either of you were born, I liquidated my entire life's savings, every single stock option I earned working 70 hours a week, and wrote a $100,000 check to pay off her student debt so she wouldn't go bankrupt. I paid off her past so she could have the very corporate career she's being celebrated for today." David's breath hitched, and Marcy's mouth opened in sheer shock. Nancy tried to speak, her lips moving, but no sound came out of her throat. "And when you were born," I continued, stepping closer to my kids, "I made a deliberate choice. I stepped away from the high-earning corporate grind and took a lower-paying government job off Haynes Bridge Road. I did it so I could be the parent who actually raised you. I took that job so I could cook your dinners 4 nights a week, drive you down GA 400 every morning, sit in freezing rain at your baseball games in McDonough, and show up to every single choral recital even when you asked me to stand in the back so your friends wouldn't see me. Every single month for 17 years, my municipal paycheck ran straight to zero to pay the mortgage on this house, the taxes, and the health insurance that protected you, while your mother kept her $6,000 monthly salary pure spending money for Whole Foods, Mercedes leases, and weekend getaways with her friends." A small gasp broke from Marcy's throat. Tears brimmed in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks as the illusion of her childhood shattered into pieces. She suddenly sprinted across the tile floor, threw her arms around my waist, and buried her face into my chest, sobbing. I wrapped one arm tightly around her shoulders, keeping my gaze locked on my son. David didn't cry. Instead, his jaw tightened so hard the muscles flexed beneath his skin. A dark fire ignited in his eyes as he looked at his mother. He slowly walked over to the kitchen island where Nancy's designer tote bag was resting. Without taking his eyes off her pale face, David reached into her bag, snatched the gleaming American Express Platinum card, the very card she had used to humiliate me weeks prior, and slammed it down onto the granite counter right next to her edible fondant cake. "Keep your trash, Mom," David spat out, his voice trembling with a cold, explosive rage that echoed off the high ceilings. "You didn't buy my future, Dad did." David turned on his heel, grabbed Marcy gently by the wrist, and looked at me. "Dad, where are our bags?" he asked softly. "In the hall closet, son," I replied gently. Without another word, David walked into the hallway, pulled my 2 packed duffel bags out of the closet, and set them by the oak front door. Marcy ran upstairs for less than 2 minutes, returning with her winter coat and her school backpack slung over her arm. David put on his jacket, picked up 2 of the bags, and stood by the door, waiting for me. I looked back at the kitchen one final time. The catering crew stood motionless by the chafing dishes, utterly stunned. Sandra sat slumped in her chair, holding a glass of water with shaking hands, completely stripped of her arrogant bite, and in the very center of the ruined party, standing alone in a house she had never owned, was Nancy, clutching a legal binder, surrounded by 20 silent guests, staring at the empty doorway where the real foundation of her life had just walked out. "Happy 40th birthday, Nancy," I said quietly. I turned around, opened the front door, and stepped out into the crisp December air with my children right behind me, leaving the wreckage of her illusions behind us forever. The front door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the chaotic murmur of shocked relatives and the suffocating air of Windham Crest Drive. The crisp December air filled my lungs like a deep drink of clean water. I loaded our suitcases into the back of my 2019 Honda Pilot, the very car my mother-in-law had sneered at and my son had once been ashamed to step out of, and closed the trunk with a solid thump. David opened the front passenger door and climbed in without a word, while Marcy settled into the back seat, pulling her coat around her shoulders. I stepped into the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror, and turned the key in the ignition. The steady, familiar hum of the engine sounded sweeter than it ever had in 7 years. I backed out of the driveway slowly, leaving the brightly lit house, the leased Mercedes, and the aftermath of 20 bewildered guests behind in the fading afternoon light. As I pointed the Pilot north onto GA 400 toward our new 3-bedroom apartment on Kimball Bridge Road, the silence inside the car was dense, but for the first time in over a decade, it wasn't heavy with unspoken resentment. It was the calm quiet of a storm that had finally passed. The highway stretched ahead through the towering Georgia pines, their dark green silhouettes standing tall against the darkening winter sky. I turned the heater dial up, letting warm air fill the cabin, warming the damp chill that had lingered in my bones since those freezing mornings on Webbridge Road and the rain-drenched bleachers in McDonough. About 10 minutes into the drive, Marcy leaned forward from the back seat, resting her chin near the center console. Her eyes were still slightly red from crying, but the guarded, calculating look she had inherited from her mother was completely gone, replaced by a soft, vulnerable curiosity. "Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to catch my heart. "The travel baseball tournament down in McDonough 3 weeks ago. Were you really sitting in the bleachers the whole 4 hours in that freezing rain?" I glanced up at her in the rearview mirror and offered a warm smile. "Every single inning, sweetheart," I replied softly, keeping my eyes on the highway ahead, from the warm-ups to the final out in the 7th. My jacket still smells like gas station coffee and cold rain, and my left shoulder was throbbing the whole drive back. But I wouldn't have missed that diving catch at third base for anything in the world. A soft, shuddering breath escaped Marcy's lips as she leaned back into her seat, a quiet nod of deep, unspoken understanding settling over her face. In the passenger seat beside me, David sat completely still. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up, pulled both wireless earbuds out of his ears, and set them down on his lap, a symbolic surrender of the wall he had built between us for 3 long years. He stared out the windshield at the passing trees for a long moment, his chest heaving with the weight of years of quiet manipulation crumbling away. Then, without saying a word, he reached his right hand across the console. He found my calloused, labor-worn hand resting near the gear shift and squeezed it tight with a fierce, trembling grip. Tears welled in the corners of my eyes as I squeezed his hand back, knowing in that single gesture that I hadn't just won a legal battle, I had recovered my son. The gray, overcast winter sky over Forsyth County finally began to break apart, letting a brilliant beam of golden late-afternoon sunlight pierce through the clouds and illuminate the pine canopy along GA 400. We pulled into the complex on Kimball Bridge Road, a clean, comfortable haven in the exact same school district, complete with a spacious kitchen and a room for each of my children. As I parked the Pilot and cut the engine, I looked at David and Marcy in the warmth of the car. The long equation had finally balanced. The house, the money, and the corporate prestige were all gone, but the foundation was right where it belonged. Grounded in truth, calm sacrifice, and unshakable love. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Dad's Ultimate Payback. If this story of an underappreciated father's quiet endurance, a mother's catastrophic arrogance, and the ultimate triumph of truth touched your heart today, please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single update. Drop a comment below letting me know the exact city, state, or country you are watching from today. A massive shout out to all our loyal viewers standing strong for their families across the globe. And if you want to see the explosive aftermath when Nancy shows up at our Kimball Bridge apartment 6 weeks later, broke and desperate to negotiate after reality hits her, let me know in the comments below. Keep your principles unshakable, protect your legacy, and I will see you in the next episode.